Good evening. My name is Brian Edwards. I'm Dean of the School of Liberal Arts here at Tulane University in beautiful New Orleans, Louisiana. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Dean Speaker Series and the second installment of a year-long series that we are calling Anti-Racism in the Disciplines. And we are thrilled to follow an event that was at the end of January, the first in the series in which Gary Hoover spoke on anti-racism and economics. And if you would like to review that series, it's up on our website, which we'll put in the chat. And we are now moving through the social sciences and are very pleased to welcome Mary Pattillo to speak to us today on anti-racism and sociology. Before I introduce our speaker and then our interlocutor, Andrea Boyles, I want to say just one more word about the series itself. The premise of the series is that the disciplines that the liberal arts are made of or comprised of themselves have histories, and that the histories themselves are often deeply imbued with structural racism or colonialism or imperialism or sometimes combinations of the three. And in order to think more deeply about scholarship within the disciplines, as well as to launch, inspire, and mentor scholarship, anti-racist scholarship for the present and the future, that a deep interrogation of those disciplines is in order. And so in order to do so tonight, we're thrilled and honored to have Mary Pattillo joining us, who is a fabulous sociologist and also just really the perfect guide to thinking about the discipline itself. Mary Pattillo is the Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and African American Studies and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University in Evanston. We see a scene behind her tonight that is Northwestern, but clearly not today. I think it's a lot colder. We like to be very proud of our weather here. So we're going to just point that out, let me just say. She is Professor Pattillo is the author of two award-winning books, Black Picket Fences, Privilege, Peril Among the Black Middle Class, and Black on the Block, The Politics of Race and Class in the City. And she has published in the American Sociological Review, Social Forces, the Du Bois Review, among many other journals. She's the winner of the 2018 Weinberg College Community Building Award, and she has received grants and fellowships from the Fulbright, MacArthur, the Ford Foundations, among others, and is a founding board member and active participant in the Urban Prep Charter Academies, which is a network of all boys public charter high schools in Chicago. Among her many honors, in last year, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And her current research is on the prevalence and impact of monetary sanctions in the criminal justice system, the role, the role of the Black middle class in Latin America, and a new research paradigm on Black advantage vision. We've invited Dr. Pattillo to speak on the theme, which she will do for approximately 30 minutes. And then she'll be joined in conversation and kind of interview or public Q&A by our colleague, Andrea Boyles. And then we will also, of course, be inviting your questions and answers, which Dr. Boyles will work into her questions, and we'll be seeing them here. So we will encourage you in the second half of the presentation, please, to join in the conversation in that way. Andrea Boyles, let me briefly introduce her. She is an award-winning author of two wonderful books. And sorry, Mary, I forgot to put yours in front of me, but I'm going to plug these books like a late night host that I sometimes feel like I am when I'm on Zooms all the time. Her books, Race, Place, and Suburban Policing, Too Close for Comfort. And then the book that I have been really particularly want to kind of plug, I've been reading, learning from, and just enjoying the fabulous writing and ethnography in it. You Can't Stop the Revolution, Community Disorder and Social Ties in Post-Ferguson America. She just began a 3-year term as on the Sociologist for Women in Society, as a Sociologist for Women in Society delegate to the United Nations Economic and Social Council, where this spring she will be presenting on Black women's activism and political participation in the United States She has, let me just say, I'm particularly thrilled to introduce her. She has recently accepted our invitation to join our permanent faculty as an associate professor of sociology and Africana studies. So she's the newest member of the Tulane faculty, and we are simply thrilled to have her here on the faculty. So thank you, Andrea, for joining us this evening to have a conversation with Mary Pattillo afterwards. Okay, you don't want to hear much more from me. I'm eager to be a member of the audience and to learn from you both. And so with that, let me again welcome Mary Pattillo to Tulane and to this series. Mary, thanks again for joining us. We're really honored to have you speaking in this series and here amongst us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dean Edwards, for the invitation, for the kind introduction, for putting me in conversation with Dr. Boyles, who we have a lot in common, and I'm just so thrilled to know that she will be permanently on the faculty. Let me share my screen and ask, I guess, Andrea to give me a thumbs up if you see my presentation in presentation mode. Okay, because you never quite know. So obviously the topic is anti-racism in sociology, and I'm going to take a piece of the discipline, a slice of the discipline, and think about ways to remedy some of the practices that sociology has engaged in by having a second title to my talk, which is this idea of Black advantage vision. And I'm pushing to flip the script on racial inequality research. So the piece of sociology I'll be focusing on is the side of sociology that talks about racial inequality, and to think about how to do that in an anti-racist way. But let me begin with a little poetry by the 5th grade class at Bradwell School of Excellence in Chicago. And they write, "This is us. We saw your news trucks and cameras here recently, and we read the articles. 6th shot in South Shore laundromat, and another mass shooting in Terrortown. We saw the reporters with fancy suits in front of our laundromat. You spent less than 24 hours here, but you don't really know us." So as I mentioned, this is the beginning of a poem written by 5th grade students in 2014, a predominantly Black elementary school in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago. And the poem begins with the deficit perspective of Black neighborhoods, the perspective that Black neighborhoods are dangerous and desperate. And then it abruptly switches gears. The children go on to write, quote, "Those who know us look at the ones who want to go to college, not the ones who dropped out of school. If you listen, you'll hear the laughter and the chattering from the group of girls on the corner who are best friends and really care about each other. Do you see the smile on the cashier's face when the kids walk in? Why? Because this neighborhood is filled with love. This isn't Chirac. This is home. This is us." So these young poets know what many sociologists do not, that being Black is marvelous. What I want to do in this talk is follow the lead of these child poets by proposing a new research agenda to combat the imbalanced production of negative findings about Black people. I'm calling this agenda Black Advantage Vision. And what Black Advantage Vision does is turns racial inequality and stratification research on its head by actively looking for domains in which Black people do better than white people and conducting studies that show this outcome. One purpose of Black Advantage Vision is to combat the role that sociology and the social sciences more generally have played in supporting anti-Black stigma. What we have done is reproduce that stigma in our research and our teaching, and we have piled on to the unrelenting barrage of negative information about Black folks that permeates US and indeed world culture. We sociologists and our research findings are partially the reason for W.E.B. Du Bois's most poignant question: how does it feel to be a problem? But I'm not just claiming that we need to participate in respectability sociology, where we might try to spruce up the image of Black folks so that white people will accept us. Because indeed, what I'm criticizing in the Black disadvantage approach that has permeated so much of sociology is that perhaps one of the worst outcomes is that Black folks ourselves have internalized the findings from that research, have internalized the stigma, and we begin to believe that we are cursed. Black advantage vision, on the other hand, reminds Black folks of our worth, our strengths, our resilience, our care, and our accomplishments. And it also lets white people know that they are not supreme. It might be said that this is an inopportune moment to claim that there are advantages to being Black, given that we are at a moment when Black folks are disproportionately suffering the twin pandemics of COVID-19, obviously, but also anti-Black police violence. These things, these twin pandemics, represent what is an ongoing onslaught of violent anti-Blackness that has characterized the nation from before its inception. And these things aren't going away soon. So now is as important as ever to answer the loop of Black death with a reminder about Black life. So I'm going to build my argument in 5 parts. First, I acknowledge some of the work that has already challenged anti-Black frameworks in sociology. This is the history of anti-racism in sociology that kind of puts this talk in the context of the speaker series. Then I'll elaborate a bit more on what I'm calling Black advantage vision. I'll present some existing studies that finds Black advantage. I will then sketch out some research methods for conducting Black advantage research, Black advantage vision research, and then I'll conclude with some final thoughts. Now, obviously, I'll be talking for 30 minutes and I have 5 parts, so I'm not going to be able to do all of this full justice. So these are really introductions to the idea, and they're also invitations for all of us to continue to write the rest of the story. So first of all, some of the critiques of the sociology, especially racial inequality sociology, stratification sociology. And these critiques, of course, date back to W.E.B. Du Bois. I'll talk a little bit more about Du Bois later, but I want to begin in 1973 with the edited volume by Joyce Ladner and colleagues called The Death of White Sociology. And in that book, they begin the introduction with the following: the refusal to address Black culture and experience has caused the distortion that we see today in sociological literature. Historically, sociologists have portrayed Blacks as disorganized, pathological, and an aberrant group. Those lines could have been written in 1933, 1953, or 2003, because the victim-blaming studies of Black pathology and underachievement continue to be published even after this intervention in 1973. Because of that, we have other folks who have continued to call for an anti-racist sociology. Patricia Hill Collins wrote again about this pathologizing approach and taught us how to do research using a Black feminist epistemology, centering an ethic of care in our research. Yet the discipline has not, for the most part, shifted its standpoint. And so we have others who have intervened in this conversation. Tukufu Zuberi and Eduardo Bonilla Silva in 2008 offer another call to resist what they call the white logic and white methods of sociology that is the general thrust of the field. Zuberi and Bonilla Silva argue that white logic is, quote, a context in which white supremacy has defined the techniques and processes of reasoning about social facts. White logic assumes a historical posture that grants eternal objectivity to the views of elite whites and condemns the views of non-whites to perpetual subjectivity. I just want to pull a little bit more on that word subjectivity, because there's no doubt that a call to actively look for outcomes on which Black people do better than white people will be judged as subjective and ideologically motivated sociology. But I want to argue that thousands of studies start off the exact same way, just from the other side. That is, thousands of studies have begun hypothesizing about, looking for, and expecting Black disadvantage. So Black advantage vision is no more subjective than Black disadvantage vision has been for the decades of the existence of the sociological discipline. There are many other instances when Black sociologists have used our second sight, as Du Bois would put it, to diagnose the infirmities of mainstream sociology. And I list a number of studies here in that last bullet point. And Black advantage vision builds on these interventions and takes specific aim at the subfield of racial stratification and inequality research, which is dominated by these findings of Black disadvantage vis-a-vis white people across multiple domains. So let me just talk a little bit more about what I mean by the Black advantage vision. Black advantage vision is about both the act and the object of seeing. So if we think about the noun vision, it describes the act of seeing, as in my vision is 20/20. So Black advantage vision asks us to retune our vision, retune our act of seeing. It asks scholars to use different eyes, to put on different glasses, to tilt our head in different ways in order for new things to come into focus. Our act of seeing needs to be like that of the 5th grade poets from South Shore. Where outsiders saw violence and disorder, those students saw friendships and hope. The noun vision, the second way I'm talking about it, can also be used in the sense of having a vision, an imagination, an object of our vision that might lay beyond the results of the questions we typically ask. So we must have a vision of Black joy in order to study it. We must have a vision of Black wealth in order to measure it. We must have a vision of Black health in order to find it. So practically and purposefully, the vision to see things differently and a vision of new things to look for is in service of actively looking for domains in which Black people do better than white people. So I anticipate a potential weakness of Black advantage vision. And it comes in the words of poets / rappers and writers, and again, Du Bois. So one of the possible critiques comes from Ice Cube, who posed the classic question in his song, True to the Game. As he parodied various versions of Black people who want to be white, Ice Cube asked, quote, but ask yourself, who are they to be equal to? So as I am thinking about Black advantage vision, where Black folks are doing better than white folks, it really raises this question of why are white people the measuring stick? James Baldwin made a similar point in The Fire Next Time when he wrote, quote, white people cannot in the generality, be taken as models of how to live. Rather, the white man himself is in sore need of new standards, which will release him from his confusion and place him once again in fruitful communion with the depths of his own being. And Du Bois said it as well, going back in time when he elaborated on his idea of double consciousness. Being Black in America, Du Bois argued, requires a constant, as he wrote, quote, both a measuring of one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. So I recognize that by working within a racial stratification framework, Black advantage vision requires comparing Black people to white people, as if white people are the appropriate or the ideal benchmark for Black people's humanity. I can see that as being problematic, but my response is that flexing our muscles of imagination will generate new measuring tapes that are not already tainted by the scorn of the white gaze, as Du Bois put it. So instead of comparing Black people to white people, Black Advantage vision can compare white people to Black people so that Black people might be the standard to be equal to. What the racial stratification approach illustrates, and what Ice Cube, Baldwin, and Du Bois all highlight, is that such comparisons inevitably require normative statements about what constitutes good outcomes and success. And I'm going to return to this normative component about what we are measuring and what we're aspiring to in my conclusion. But first, let me turn to some evidence that already exists in this field about Black Advantage. So I began thinking about this topic when I was teaching a class called The Social Meaning of Race. And we had a week in which I methodically worked through the Black-white wealth gap, explaining the history and contemporary manifestations of the Black-white wealth gap. And that was a heavy day of recounting 400 years of enslavement, of theft, of violence, of exclusion, and the resulting disadvantages that we witness today in what is a Black-white wealth gap of about tenfold. And I was exhausted, and I was just like sad. It was depressing. And so I decided to dedicate a day to empirically documenting the benefits of being Black. So we had been kind of knocked down, and now it was like, well, what's good about being Black? And I will say it wasn't easy to find this research because the benefits are drowned out by research on Black disadvantage. So this is where the indictment of the sociological gaze comes into play. There's so much research on Black disadvantage that it's hard to find Black advantage findings. And indeed, I think the search algorithms are trained to find Black disadvantage. So for example, when I typed into Google, quote, diseases less common in Black people, the first result I got was, the title said, why 7 deadly diseases strike Blacks most. Exactly the opposite of what I was searching for. So Black disadvantage leads even when you're not searching for it. So it took a lot of digging, but I was able to put together a solid lecture for the class on a number of domains where Black folks did better than white folks. And when I finished that lecture, I asked my students, what is it about Black culture, Black families, Black neighborhoods, Black institutions that yield these positive results? And conversely, what is lacking in white spaces, white culture, white institutions, and in whiteness that disadvantages them? These are not questions that we usually ask because we're usually so drowned in Black disadvantage research. So the exercise got me curious, and I set out to find other studies that found Black advantage. And I can talk more about how I did this in the Q&A, but I ended up with a table. This is just the first page of the table. It actually has 2 parts, a whole nother thing where I divided it up by domain. And this is just a list of a number of studies. You can probably barely see even these things, but I'm gonna go a little deeper on just one of them. So while it looks like there might be lots of studies, and again, there's another whole nother page of this, like I said, I sorted through hundreds, if not thousands of studies to come up with 2 pages that found Black advantage. But let me go a little bit deeper on just one topic, which is Black advantage for young people. So just to list it off for you, all things equal, Black students are more likely to attend college than white students, all things equal being controlling for socioeconomic background and test scores. Black children attain more education once you control for families, background, and neighborhoods. Black youth are more likely to graduate from high school once you control for socioeconomic background and wealth, or if you control for where they were born. Black parents and students show more positive attitudes towards education and towards college than do white students. People always say, yeah, but you're controlling for socioeconomic background, but Black people are disproportionately poor and have less wealth. And that is true. But the way to read this finding is that if you compare Black poor kids and white poor kids, or if you compare Black middle class kids and white middle class kids, and with similar amounts of wealth, Black folks are more likely to graduate from high school. Meaning, if Black folks had the characteristics of white folks, Black folks would be graduating in higher numbers. I have a whole nother page. Black teachers are advantageous for Black students. They lower Black boys' dropout rate and increase Black boys' interest in school. Black teachers practice less exclusionary discipline, indeed, for all students, and they're less likely to label Black students' behaviors, negatively label Black students' behaviors. More Black neighborhoods that have a higher proportion of Black residents, and more residentially stable neighborhoods lead to less internalizing behavior among Black adolescents. And Black poor children heard more words per hour than children in all other race and SES groups. This was a study published in the premier journal, Child Development, and on a very robust set of data. So who knew? Did you know? Did you know of all of these Black Advantage findings? I don't think we talk about these things enough. And the goal of Black Advantage vision is to fill many more tables with these kinds of findings. So the next section is how to do this research to move forward this agenda. What is a Black Advantage vision method? I, in the longer paper, go through methodically each of these moments of research that tells us how we might employ and deploy a Black Advantage vision method. I don't have time for all this, so I'm just going to do the red ones. So beginning with theory and our assumptions. Research about Black Advantage, using Black Advantage vision must actively reject a deficit framework. If we generally think Black folks are universally downtrodden and desperate, then we will set off to find it, and we will find it. And if we don't find it where we look, we'll be startled. We may not even think to get our research published, and we might label that finding a paradox. That's if we set off looking for Black disadvantage. Instead, Black Advantage vision requires us to begin by recognizing the full humanity of Black folks, which of course includes some mix of suffering and triumph. Black Advantage vision is a comparative method. So you have to have some theory about a particular behavior, attribute, or trait that might manifest among both Black and white people, and why it might manifest positively among Black folks, but not white folks. So it's equally open to finding white disadvantage as it is Black advantage, just the converse. And it's not about bashing whiteness, but rather to illuminate the fact that white people can also make bad choices, be lazy, or be blinded by their privilege. Then we move to posing the question. Again, in Black Advantage vision, the question must compare Black and white people and be motivated by a reasonable hypothesis that the answer will show a Black advantage. For example, in doing my research on looking for domains in which Black folks do better than white folks, one study I found was that Black people have more cousins. We also have more half siblings, but I'll start with the cousins. Black folks have more cousins in their families than white people. Now, this finding answered a rhetorical joke that my friends and family and I had bandied about for many years. We often asked ourselves, do white people have cousins? Because we frequently found ourselves talking about our cousins in interracial settings, and we never heard white people talking about their cousins. So we wondered, do white people have cousins? Obviously, just any family tree will tell you, of course, white people have cousins. But now we actually know that Black people have more cousins. So a Black Advantage vision research question might ask, does the greater likelihood of having a cousin among Black folks lead to less social isolation or better socio-emotional development for only children? So only children might be able to benefit from having cousins And since Black folks have more cousins, that might benefit Black only children. Does having more cousins lead to less social isolation in old age? Does having more cousins lead to greater access to childcare among single mothers? These are places we might find a Black advantage because of the advantage in having cousins. So generating the research question is the moment to possibly stake new normative claims about what constitutes healthy, productive, or well-adjusted behavior. But we know posing new questions might also be scary because we have to appease our advisors, the journal reviewers, and the field at large. But hopefully the payoff is in trailblazing new fields of research that we hadn't thought about before because we were so myopic in our focus on Black disadvantage. So then finally on dissemination, the aim of Black Advantage Vision, as I mentioned, is to fill more of those tables that I mentioned. Obviously, we should talk about this in our op-eds, in our interviews with journals, talking to public audiences. But I want to say that our most effective kingdom in which to disseminate Black Advantage Vision findings is in the classroom. As I mentioned, this whole exercise began out of a frustration with drowning my students in Black disadvantage. And it was frustrating both because I knew it wasn't true. Like those fifth grade poets, I knew that being Black is marvelous. And I wanted some research to show that. It was also very frustrating because I was almost like my students could write their papers before they had even taken my class by just spitting out that on every measure, Black folks do worse than white folks. And that's just not the empirical point or the empirical truth. So it was a real treat for me the day that I taught the Black Advantage Vision module. And I look forward to doing more of it, but we have to produce more research to be able to do that in our classrooms. So let me conclude on this normative point that I raised. And I want to give a shout out to the Afrofuturists. So I'm not a card-carrying Afrofuturist, but when poet and sociologist Eve Ewing writes, quote, "In the future, every child in Chicago has food and a safe place to sleep, and mothers laugh all day and eat popsicles." When Eve Ewing writes that, I can't help but smile and agree. The young people who are leading today's Black protest organizations are all imagining new futures. For example, the Black Youth Project has authored a document entitled, quote, "Agenda to Build Black Futures." And the founders of Black Lives Matter now run the Black Futures Lab. All of these references to the future are statements that the present is not acceptable and that the future must be different. So when I think about the work that they're doing, I recognize that Black Advantage Vision might already be antiquated because in the policy statement of the Movement for Black Lives, they write, quote, "We reject false solutions and believe we can achieve a complete transformation of the current systems, which place the current systems place profit over people and make it impossible for many of us to breathe." So when you read something like that, such a revolution could abolish white and Black advantage and disadvantage. More deeply, I think it challenges a focus on racial inequality and equality, and instead rejects these comparisons with white people altogether. Indeed, the agenda to build Black futures by BYP 100, their agenda is that, quote, "all Black people are able to live in their dignity." So it makes me ask if equality is right, or does Black dignity require Black people to have the wealth of white people? Does Black dignity require Black folks to have the home ownership rates of white people, the occupational attainment of white people? What will society look like when dignity or justice or freedom or joy or liberation or love are the normative aspirations? What kind of research does that require instead of thinking about, as these revolutionaries think about it, the way that capitalism has created these other measures, home ownership, wealth, and so on, as our outcome measures, as opposed to dignity, freedom, joy, and liberation. So on this point about thinking about futures, I want to end with poetry again. And this comes from Tracy K. Smith, who was the US Poet Laureate, and she muses in her poem entitled Dear Black America. She says, quote, "Once a friend told me, I think we came to this earth to save it. Once I wrote in a notebook, maybe we are operating at a heightened spiritual frequency." So for now, Black Advantage Vision can work to empirically document the higher frequency on which Black people might be operating. But for the future, once we've saved the earth, such research, I hope, won't be necessary. I will stop there and open it up for conversation with Dr. Boyles and with all of you all.
Wow, that's so profound and deep. I don't even know where to begin, honestly. There's so much rich information there. I think what I'll do, if it's okay, Mary, real quickly, I want to thank Brian for such a wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be on board permanently with the Tulane family, so I want to make sure to acknowledge that. And I can't think of a better way to begin that journey than here with you this evening. And so for transparency, I'm biased. So much of Mary's work is certainly a guide and inspiration for mine, more recently, even that I've done in Ferguson. But the idea of Black Advantage Vision is so transformative. I guess things that came to my mind almost immediately is that, one of the things that activists talk to me about is that they didn't want, in particular, and I'm paraphrasing, he said that they didn't know what freedom looked like. They didn't know what that meant. All they know is that, or all he knew, he said freedom or liberation, one of the two, but all he could think is that we're fighting to get the foot off our necks. Mm-hmm. And so I thought about that in the sense that, if I'm correct, what you're challenging us to do through Black Advantage Vision is to think beyond the foot on the neck, to consider, to press pause and really be deliberate and intentional about what freedom, what that really means. We know what the fight means. We know how to do that. Mm-hmm. But what, yeah, how to, will you expound on that?
Yeah, so I think that's a great, yes, I totally agree. And I think the foot on our neck is what I'm characterizing as the research that has found so much Black disadvantage, because that foot on our neck is what, creates the less wealth and leads to all of the negative health outcomes, the increased stress, the higher mortality for cardiovascular diseases, all of those things is because of the foot on the neck, no question. And let me be 100% clear. I am not saying that we should stop research that finds those outcomes. So, I often think of a time I spent a month in Paris at Sciences Po, speaking on my research and learning about what they were doing about racial inequality in Paris and France. And, they don't collect racial statistics in France, and they can't even do the kind of research that we do that finds disparities in employment or health disparities or so on. And so I'm not arguing that if we just stop doing the research, maybe the problem will go away, which is, I don't think the French think the problem is going to go away, but they surely don't even know what the problem is. So I'm not arguing that. There's always, sociology is a big field, social sciences are multifold and can do lots of research. And it's important because we need, for example, if we didn't have the folks who did research who showed the disproportionate part of city budgets that go to policing, then we wouldn't be able to make such a strong claim about abolition because of that disproportionality. So what I am arguing for is kind of seeding a generation to also do some countervailing research. And that is going beyond the foot on our neck and recognizing what we also do when the foot is not so strong on our neck and how we have, the perseverance, the resilience, the creativity, the care. Andrea, you study this in your book, the very poignant pictures you show in this moment of grief that Michael Brown's mother was experiencing, the arms that wrapped around her, the folks who waited when the police were keeping people away from the crime scene. When they opened it up, the people came and were there and immediately collectively mourned and supported. We should not have to be mourning the loss of our 18-year-old children, but that is the indication of the collective strength that we maintain. And just imagine how much we could invent, how much we could do if we would free up that energy from mourning together with our family members and neighbors who have lost loved ones, and can put it into other directions, more, reading and creating and inventing and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to do is, yes, seed that other side of the research, that of the things that we're already doing well and even doing better than white people, to be a balance for what we know with the foot on the neck. And I also want to say one thing you point out is that, there's a narrow idea of Black Advantage vision that has to be comparative and compare Black folks and white folks. But the other possibility is research that I think Black folks have been doing, and especially in Africana studies, in the humanities, which is about, Robin Kelley has a book called Freedom Dreams, which is about how Black folks dream about freedom. And I think we do that outside of sociology. And I think we could do some of that in sociology as well. It's not narrowly what I'm talking about in terms of Black Advantage vision, but it fits within that spirit.
Yeah, that I won't say almost, I did. I teared up a little bit because I think, which leads into my next question, some of your reference even to my own work there in Ferguson, because psychologically, I don't necessarily know if I want to say psychologically, but I think it was really a fight to the finish, trying to capture from start, and years into, the uprising, the ways in which Black folks were taking care of each other, because there were so many forces. And I will not just even leave that to Ferguson, but beyond it. There were so many forces every moment of the way, every minute that countered that. And so I feel like you just gave me a star. Like I feel like I got a good grade just now, because literally it's like fighting. You like there was this inner fight to push past the narratives, and that in and of itself is a whole other kind of power, right? And so trying to do work when there are competing narratives, and yours is going to take years to come to fruition. And in the meanwhile, these narratives are like popping every minute of the day. How do we train ourselves, or do we train ourselves? Like, I don't even know, like, if I had to explain how to make that happen, I don't know that I could in a very real way.
What's interesting to me is, we always indict journalists by that saying, I forgot how the saying, but it's like death leads or blood leads or fire leads. There's something leads that we're talking about when we're talking about journalism and journalists. that is always the negative leads. Negative information gets more attention than positive, and journalists have to fight to do the positive public interest story, for example. So
Mary,
I
someone
actually,
just said, if it bleeds, it leads.
thank you
Yep,
so
that's it.
much.
That's the
Thank
one.
you. That
Yeah,
was Dean Edwards. Thank you. If it
Yeah.
bleeds, it leads. So
Yeah.
exactly. And, I think we sociologists are kind of like that as well. And that the analogy is not necessarily just blood, but it is about, we're a social problems discipline. And, I wonder if we turn off majors and minors because of that. I know they're often hungry for solutions. And so my point is not so much about solutions, because I do think there are fields more, better equipped and trained to talk about solutions. We can talk about solutions, but I think there are other disciplines that do that. But we might also think about, the human condition and the social condition is not all social problems. There is also social organization and social creativity and social support. And of course, sociologists study social support, but we often study social support by wondering who does more of it and who has less of it. And then we frame it as in, people age and they lose their social support networks, rather than the other side of the frame. So I think we have something to think about even beyond Black Advantage Vision, to think about the social problems, the heaviness of the social problems framework that stops us from looking at resilience, supports, perseverance, those kinds of things. But your question also raises something that I see in the Q&A, actually. Somebody's pointing out a special issue that I will definitely be sure to take a look at. But the crux of the question is, can you speak to the struggle of doing this kind of work in our fields? In sociology is what we're talking about today, and particularly being Black women sociologists and doing this kind of work. So I will start actually by saying, Andrea, I had a different experience from yours when you said it was so hard to push past the narratives. When I was writing Black Picket Fences, now on the one hand, someone can say I was following the Black disadvantage narrative. But the subtitle is Privilege and Peril Among the Black Middle Class. And it really is about ways that the Black middle class has privilege, but it's also about the peril, and that's the disadvantage narrative. But in that book, I have a chapter called Nike's Reign, which is about young Black folks sitting around talking about gym shoes. And it is about how people create community over in this particular, it's about consumerism, but it's about a particular topic. And I had fun writing that chapter. And I don't remember the editor or my dissertation committee telling me, what is this chapter doing in there? So maybe I was lucky, but it was my way of recognizing the everydayness of Black life. Even in a neighborhood that I was talking about as, Black middle class neighborhoods are more challenged combating crime and have higher poverty rates. And, there was the peril of living in Black middle class neighborhoods, but there was also just the everyday. So, I think those of us who are advisors and journal article reviewers and all those kinds of things have to open up that space. I am, like I said, lucky that my dissertation committee didn't balk at that. And we have to continue, we need to do that as dissertation committees as well. So I think there is some experience in the academy among Black scholars, non-Black scholars, and so on, who are pushing against this narrative with various experiences doing so. Some of us, it might have been a little easier. Others of us might have hit roadblocks with the publisher or with a reviewer, those kinds of things. But I think the more of us who get in positions of reading book manuscripts and being journal editors and so on and so forth, I think we can open up those gates for this kind of work and other kinds of work. Sorry, I just want to say I misattributed "It Bleeds, It Leads." When it came up on my screen, I thought that was Dean Edwards saying that, but it was Vicky Meyer who let us know if it bleeds, it leads.
Okay, yeah. Let's see, I think,
Oh, I see.
Brian.
Dean Edwards did also. So both of y'all said it.
Yeah.
Double credit.
Yeah. So I think going back to the question also with Black women sociologists and the struggle, I think, you know, I felt injured a lot. I feel like I think maybe that's the space where I'm speaking from about the difficulties. Someone asked the question, can advantage also be disadvantage? So I'll tack this on to, if I can preface this question with our previous conversation. I think that I felt injured a lot because here I was witnessing Black advantage in many respects taking place, and I'm capturing that. But I felt hurt all the time that that wasn't being communicated, that was not being expressed. And I felt that, and I kind of knew that I had to lock in, and I committed myself to getting that, making sure that that was expressed, but I knew it would take time to do so. And so in the meanwhile, it was the constant trying to sort of compartmentalize the hurt that I was feeling because it was not highlighted the way that I, knew, and the way you so eloquently put it should have been. The other piece is that I also knew that the challenge was going to be doing so as one, as best as I know to this date, the first sociologist and criminologist and expert on Black citizen police conflict on the ground. So I was going to have the first potential empirical account, the first historical marker as a woman, as a Black woman in a white male discipline. And so what did that mean in several white male disciplines, across several disciplines? What did that mean? So I guess my question, I'm prefacing with that because can advantage is what has been asked also be disadvantage?
Yeah, so I really like that question, but I wanna follow up on your own work. I know I'm the speaker, but let me just tell y'all why Dr. Boyles' work is so fresh for me. I am doing an independent study with a graduate student right now who put Dr. Boyles' book on their syllabus for the quarter. And it just so happens we meet every Tuesday from 2 to 3. And today was the day on the syllabus that we were reading Dr. Boyles' book, You Can't Stop the Revolution. And so I joked with my graduate student. I was like, it's like the Dr. Boyles day today, because we had the lunchtime thing. Then I talked with my graduate students, and now we're here. So, You Can't Stop the Revolution is very fresh in my mind. And I want to, for the folks who don't know, I want to give a scene from the very powerful book about what Dr. Boyles is referring to in terms of when Black folks were showing this care, this advantage, the matter of Black lives, the positive matter of Black lives, when Black folks were coming to the support of Michael Brown's mother and making this memorial, Dr. Boyles describes the scene where the police return then to the scene and drive over the memorial that Black folks have just created. So at every turn, when Black folks are, peacefully and lovingly putting their arms around a mother who has lost their son, they are punished once again. And the police don't, they are completely oblivious to, from all they see is, the way that Darren Wilson described Michael Brown as, it and a Hulk. That's all they see. And so they drive through the crowd as if there are no humans there, as if there is no humanity there. And that's the injury that I know you're talking about. And that is the injury that many of us who study Black neighborhoods and interview Black people hear time and time again in our research. And, you know, on the one hand, you feel disingenuous to then be all kind of Pollyannish and act as if Black life, you know, well, being Black is just great. So I recognize that it is about a balancing act, and that we cannot only do one side or the other. On this specific question about can Black advantage be disadvantage, I think that is an excellent question, because you're right. Framing advantage and disadvantage requires us to ask, for what outcomes, in what domains? And for sociologists, as we talk about, say, social capital and cultural capital, sociologists have written about this. So Prudence Carter's work, for example, on cultural capital in schools in New York, you know, the cultural capital that you need to survive in your neighborhood is different than the cultural capital that's going to make you successful in the classroom. And that doesn't mean that Black kids don't have cultural capital. It's just a different kind of, so their cultural capital is advantageous in their neighborhood, whether that is knowing how to walk down the street and exude confidence so nobody messes with you. You know, that is an important cultural capital and advantageous in the neighborhood, that can then become disadvantageous in the classroom if a teacher who's not conversant in and a good reader of your cultural capital then reads you to be aggressive or threatening, and thus labels you in that way. So most definitely, but in many domains, we can think about how something can work somewhere and not somewhere else. And I also want to say that on the normative front of what outcomes we are measuring. So, you know, I mentioned we're often thinking about wealth as an outcome, but how are we measuring wealth? So we could imagine measuring wealth as the ability to save when you are at a poverty level income. So how do we think about the actual wealth accumulation that exists in Black neighborhoods? And should we frame the grotesque wealth at the very upper end as an advantage? This gets back to James Baldwin's quote, which I'll just read again really quickly. White people cannot in the generality be taken as models of how to live. Rather, the white man is himself in sore need of new standards, which will release him from his confusion and place him once again in fruitful communion with the depths of his own being. You know, does having $1 billion put you in communion with the depths of your own being? What is that right here of all the normative questions? What is that right? What are the outcomes we should be, what should be our goals? And that means that perhaps the higher tail end of the wealth distribution is similarly, we should consider that a disadvantage, because we should wonder if folks are in communion with the depths of their own being at that end of the scale.
I forget sometimes to take the mute off. I'm going to pull a question here. So they're talking about disadvantage for the sake of survival. And then can you at the same time celebrate? So I would imagine that's about Black joy, Black joy, exactly. Black achievement. Yeah.
On how, and so when I was reading, so the question, I'm not sure if actually everybody in the audience can see the question. So can you comment on how you can manage? Okay, so people in the audience can't see the question. So let me read it. I'll read it and then say how I'm hearing it. So can you comment on how you can manage disadvantagement for survival purposes, and while at the same time celebrating Black joy and achievement? So when I read disadvantagement, actually it's an interesting creation, word creation, because I think of disadvantagement as external forces creating that disadvantage. But I think perhaps also what is meant here is that, I think there is a level of survival that creates that has us do things that may not advantage us in other domains. And so I think that gets back to this question of how disadvantage can be advantage. So, you know, for survival purposes, you know, many people who study how people manage money at the lower end of the income structure, lower end of the income structure, for example, support family members because they will expect reciprocal support down the line. And we could argue that, and that's a survival purpose, right? You can't deny your cousin the $10 loan when you have it, because you know you're going to ask your cousin 2 months later to take you grocery shopping. Carol Stack writes about this in her book, All Our Kin. We could imagine that as disadvantaging you in the long run. Meaning, if you were more selfish and put that $10 in a savings account, you might be able to save up your $10 so that you can get the security deposit for an apartment in a neighborhood where you want to move that has a better school system, and kind of be the stepping stone for not just surviving, but you know, kind of perhaps ensuring some upward mobility for the next generation. So here we see a decision that might disadvantage you, loaning the $10 for survival purposes, because you're focused on the reciprocation that might come down the line, that might but disadvantage you from saving for your future success. So I can see how that would work, but I think it's related to the questioners, you know, about how we can celebrate joy, because that reciprocation is something I think we need to think about as a strength of Black communities. And the lack of selfishness in loaning that $10 is about this collective support as opposed to my own nuclear family's advancement. The challenge always is that Black families, Black individuals are within an individualistic society that measures success on an individualistic level. And so it makes it different. Any kind of collective schema or collective orientation ultimately is disadvantaged in what is a larger capitalist structure that is very individualist. Yeah, so I think that's where I'll end that question. And then
There's
see it.
another.
Yeah. Do you, and Andrea, do you want to say anything about that point? Any thoughts come to your mind?
Only that I've personally have thought quite a bit and spent time, and I'm actually writing a piece on Black joy. And so I think that, you know, there's a way to certainly have both conversations, but at the same time, without compromising Black advantage in the process. I think the thing that I'm maybe extending from that conversation, disadvantagement, that's a great word to coin, in fact. But I think that the idea that there is this space where we continue to have these parallel, it's sort of like a parallel universe happening. And the constant, the maneuvering of it is work in and of itself. How do we even think about, you know, and now I'm asking another question, so I won't do that. But but that's what came to my mind. It's the constant, is the maneuvering from one space to the next.
Yes. And
how to make the one work actually to the advantage of the other in some way. And so how do you how do you take the disadvantage that we all know so well, in the fact that we've been disadvantaged, and that's in minoritized, how do you take that, or at least use it to center the areas? But your point is that we don't start there. We start from the areas where we've already been advantaged, and then do we go back and call out the disadvantage out
I
of
mean,
that?
I think my point is that sociology is a big field. There will always be folks, and we need folks who are studying the, mass incarceration, who are studying how educational outcomes in the tradition with the traditional test score outcomes, for example. We need folks who are studying family formation. We need folks who are studying health disparities. No question. I mean, we got to know what the disparities in mortality rates. We need to know, for example, that Black women are much more likely to die in childbirth than white women, but we need to know that not for some kind of obscene voyeurism, which I think can often be how we participate in the consumption of the sociological findings, and how when I'm teaching them, they begin to weigh on me. So we have to break up that, that Black women are more likely to die in childbirth, and that the Black infant mortality rate is so many times higher. We have to break that up with, for example, when I was doing my lecture, Black women are much less likely to smoke while pregnant, for example. And what knowing that does is, the knee-jerk reaction to Black women are more likely to die in childbirth, and the Black infant mortality rate is much higher. Our students' thought processes are, what are Black women doing wrong? All of the thought process, Amanda and John Diamond and Amanda, why am I blanking on Amanda's last name, but their book, Despite the Best Intentions, Amanda Lewis, talk about how they were brought into a suburban school system to address the Black-white educational gap in that school. And, the school leader asked them basically, how do we help our Black students? But their lens is, what are the white students and white parents and white administrators doing that is depressing the performance of Black students in this school? So I think, that's how I'm thinking about balancing out the way we're thinking. So back to the Black infant mortality and Black mother childbirth story. If we think, if we know that Black women are much less likely to smoke during pregnancy, for example, that just gives us a data point to say, Black women are doing some good things when they're pregnant. Black women are taking care of themselves. And not, we can't always jump to what are Black women doing wrong in pregnancy that's disadvantaging themselves and their babies.
There are a couple of questions. One speaks to competing strands in the history of sociology as a discipline. Let me ask you this, and then I'll get further into this question, because they kind of, they're connected in some ways. So in your presentation, you talked about and quoted, in fact, Joyce Latner's, and the idea of, how to sort of think about Black perspectives, Black experiences in sociology in a way that flips essentially white sociology, what we've thought of in terms of white sociology on its head. How do we begin the conversation with Blackness and the Black experience? I guess the question is, how then do we enter into space, either in intro sociology or other courses where we find ourselves having conversations about the history of the discipline? How do we have that conversation? I know, at least in my experience, one of the things I've had to do to even begin the Black perspective is to sort of unpack imperialism, unpack colonialism, and all those things, right? So what are the competing strands between Durkheim, Du Bois, our approaches, what kinds of curriculum,
Yeah.
It's a lot there, but I'm just wondering,
Yeah, so I wanna, while the book, Ladner's book, The Death of White Sociology, is a super important book, and the title is super important. And again, Tukufu Zuberi and Eduardo Bonilla Silva's book, White Logic, White Methods, similarly has that title. I want to clarify what I think the word white is doing in those titles. Because the figure that I showed lists of studies that found Black advantage, that table that I showed, the majority of those authors were not Black. So it's not that only Black people can do Black Advantage Vision research, for example. It is about a framework. And so when Zuberi and Eduardo Bonilla Silva talk about white logic, white methods, it's named that because the discipline, we often think about the discipline as having Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Zimmel as our classical theorists, all white European men. And so we frame it that way. But I think we know there are efforts afoot to recognize the early interventions of especially Du Bois, but the whole Atlanta School and Alden Morris's great book on W.E.B. Du Bois, The Scholar Denied, recovers the work of a number of early Black sociologists, and I would add non-trained sociologists like Ida B. Wells, for example, who was collecting data on lynching in her efforts to get an anti-lynching law. So I think if we recognize how the discipline had early founders who were pushing against, at that time, theories that very much dehumanized Black folks. That was kind of at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, the height of race science. Folks were measuring people's skulls and all kinds of things. And so Du Bois and others were pushing hard against those. Later Franz Boas, who wasn't Black, but was definitely pushing against this racist race science, supposed pseudo race science. That's part of our lineage as well. And so I think it's, when we teach, I'm teaching Intro to Sociology right now, as a matter of fact, to students at the Stateville Correctional Center here in Illinois. And we're using a textbook, and I have definitely had to augment the textbook. So there wasn't enough Du Bois for my liking. And especially on the Race and Gender Week, I had to send in some extra readings because those are my areas of expertise, and it wasn't doing justice. And I will write to the editor and give my feedback on ways to expand that. But I think we're very much in that moment. I think this discussion, the fact that we're having this discussion and that Dean Edwards is talking about anti-racism in the various disciplines is an illustration of doing that work. So I'm very optimistic that that our way of teaching. So for me, in what I've talked about today, the way of teaching is about balancing my courses about Black joy and Black disadvantage. And I taught a class called Intro to Black Social and Political Life in the fall, where my opening statements was about the paradox of Black life. We cannot close our eyes to the foot on our neck, as Dr. Boyle said, but we also can't not see double Dutch and music and politics and new visions of freedom and inventions and poetry and all of that. We got to see all of that. So I began about that paradox to try to have that balance throughout my class. And that's, how I am looking forward to teaching moving forward.
Mary, someone asked, can you have a conversation, or can we imagine, would it be useful to imagine a white disadvantage vision?
So
so a follow-up question then would be, so let's say if we did, would that then center whiteness?
Yeah, so I see where the questioner is going. So that's helpful. Let me just read the rest, because that's helpful for understanding. So I could imagine studies of the disadvantages, the epistemic, the moral, the spiritual, the perhaps in some instances even material disadvantages to occupying the putative advantaged position of whiteness in a system that's built on oppressing others. So yeah, that's, I think, I think that's happening. Critical whiteness studies is about, what do white people lose in upholding and embodying and fighting for white privilege. What, as you mentioned, epistemic, moral, spiritual, material, perhaps. And I think that's something to, something to think more about. As I mentioned, Black Advantage vision is about a way of seeing and an object of seeing. And, I just told a student just the other day that if your head doesn't hurt, you're not learning. And so my head is hurting a little bit right now because thinking about this question, because it does require us to think about what might be the material disadvantages of white, of this history of imperialism, colonialism. Du Bois diagnosed it well for poor white people in his book, Black Reconstruction. And he showed how poor white people in particular have the wool pulled over their eyes, that they're participating in white privilege when in fact their exploitation is part of the same system that includes Black exploitation as well. And so I think that is a place to begin with the material deprivation that some white people experience. David Rodiger called this the wages, well, building on Du Bois, the wages of whiteness. White folks get a wage, a symbolic wage, earnings from their whiteness. And for poor white people, that symbolic wage, it ain't money you can spend at the grocery store, but it's symbolic and psychological, is part of the structure that keeps poor white people in particular disconnected from Black workers who they might otherwise find alliances and allegiances with. So that's, I think, a place where we can think about even material disadvantages to upholding white supremacy and white privilege. So yeah, I think this is a really generative question. I think it's something that people in critical whiteness studies are beginning to think about, and a good direction to go.
I'll take a couple more questions and then I think we might be just about at time. So the next question, can you speak to gatekeeping? This is an IRB question. It seems that some of the issues you're discussing arise out of institutional racism at the level of which human study research projects get funded and approved, and why, which is a highly regulated industry. No?
Oh, let me think about that. So the question about the Institutional Review Board, for folks who don't have to go through the Institutional Review Board, this is the body on any university campus that reviews any of our research if we're going to be working with human subjects. That could be the medical school people, but for those of us who are social scientists, that usually means interviewing folks, doing ethnography with folks, maybe doing some surveys with folks. We're usually not, giving people medicine or poking them, although some sociologists also poke people these days. I don't see the IRB as being the biggest gatekeeper problem, because the goal of the IRB is to make sure our research is ethical, to make sure that we are protecting people's anonymity. If they want their anonymity protected, at Northwestern, at least you can get approval to use people's real names if you get the people's approvals to use their real names. So it's about doing ethical research. So I'm not sure that this would run afoul of that. I mean, I guess maybe what you're imagining is if there is a proposal where your hypothesis is that white people might end up looking bad in some way, that if you assume many of the gatekeepers are also white, they might protest this hypothesis in the first place. That's a possibility. Maybe I'm too optimistic to think it wouldn't happen and that they will stick to their role of questioning if the research is ethical as opposed to if the research will find what they wanted to find. But it's an interesting, but I think gatekeeping is super important. I think the bigger gatekeeping problem is grant funding and journal reviewers. So, if it bleeds, it leads means that our grant foundation, our foundations, our NSF and so on, their, racial inequality stratification research has a way, and it almost always hypothesizes Black disadvantage. If you go against that grain and start studying outcomes that you now, have a different vision of what we're studying at the end, a different dependent variable, that is where I see perhaps not getting the money to do so, or journal reviewers wondering, is this finding really right? I mean, I should do this. Talk to some of this I think is in the vein of Black Advantage vision research, which is talking to some of the authors of some of these findings and wondering if they got pushback in their journal review process. The people who find that Black folks actually go to college more if you control for SES and test scores. Do they get pushback? Like, are you sure your data is right? That's, I think, a bigger gatekeeper than the IRB would be. But there could be things I'm not thinking about.
Yeah, one more thing, and then I'll turn it back over to Brian. So there's a theoretical question. What theoretical framework are you planning to use? And they're really excited about your research. This is needed to highlight Black excellence. I agree.
Yeah,
What
I think I'm kind of thinking of Black Advantage vision as a theoretical framework, although obviously, and the longer paper draws it out a little bit more. But
I'll be using it. That's for sure.
Well, thank you. And as I will plug your work again, Dr. Boyles, because
oh my gosh,
important points in your book. I really do recommend You Can't Stop the Revolution. But I think, there are other works that are coming out right now. So Zandria Robinson and Marcus Hunter have a book called Chocolate City.
Yep.
That I really think is important to kind of flesh out a little bit more of this, of the theoretical apparatus that one could use. And in psychology, I think there are more folks like Margaret Beale Spencer, for example, has put forward a psychological theory about Black resilience, for example. Eve Tuck in the education space has talked a lot about looking at strengths rather than weaknesses. So there is my colleague at Northwestern, Mesman Destin, in psychology. There are people who are making statements about a strengths-based approach as opposed to a deficits-based approach. I think that's the kind of way to think about it from the theoretical perspective.
Okay. All right, well, I think at this point, well, first, let me say thank you so much. This has been such a honor, oh my gosh. And so I appreciate, and I think I speak for everyone when I say that we appreciate having you here. And at this point, I think I'll turn it back into the hands of Brian. But it's been a wonderful evening. I'm so excited. I'm still so very excited. It'll take a minute to wind down, I think.
Well, thank you. It's been great to be in conversation with you for sure. And I'm so happy that Tulane is going to be benefiting from your brilliance.
Thank you both. Mary, Andrea, this conversation is, as a word that keeps coming, is incredibly generative, and listening to you both speak and engage is just really inspiring. And I'm just watching the questions and comments coming in on the Q&A as well. You can see how many students, colleagues, both from here and elsewhere, are feeling the same way. I wanted to say, Mary, thank you also, and I should have mentioned in the beginning, early in the day, part of these events is to have as part of inspiring work for the next generation is having these workshops. And I know that earlier today, you had apparently a very well attended workshop with faculty and graduate student colleagues. So thank you for doing that. And really, the brilliant way that you kind of weaving together history of the field, other scholarship, teaching, pedagogy at all different levels, and then a new way of thinking about your own work and work that could emerge from that is just fabulous, and everything we could hope for in this series. So I really want to thank you for taking the time. These are recorded, and so have them on our website, which we put up in the chat at the beginning, and you can see them there. Let me, if you don't mind, we've plugged, I jokingly said to Dr. Boyles that Mary's going to ask you for a share of the royalties because we've sold a lot of copies of your book, but it is everything that has been said. But let me plug the next event in this series, which is at the end of the month on Tuesday, March 30th in the evening. We have Lee Baker, who's professor of culture, anthropology, sociology, and African American studies at Duke University, who's going to speak about anti-racism and anthropology. And oh boy, that's going to be interesting to talk about a history of the field.
Yes, definitely. He's got to, I mean, I don't want to claim that sociologists are better than anthropologists, but he's got a lot more junk to deal with.
Well, and I have to say, looking, because I know folks who are participating can't see the way these webinars work, but I can kind of look at the audience, so to speak. And I've been really pleased to see not only a lot of our sociologists, our faculty and graduate students in the audience, but also faculty and graduate students from a range of disciplines joining us this evening, including previous speakers in the series. I saw Hoof was on the call and asked the question. So we're really looking at the disciplines, but also thinking across disciplines at the same time. And I've said it to you, Mary, because one of the sad things about inviting people during a pandemic is, that we can't bring you here and now go out to a nice dinner or have a nice reception where everyone could chat. And we really are hoping that the end of this series, which is I've already scheduled someone for 2022 in it, that we can hopefully bring back our speakers in person to our campus and really think about what it looks like to look across a number of disciplines. Anyway, saying a lot there.
I would love that.
We'd love to have you back. I know you have connections to New Orleans as well. Right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
In any case, thank you again. I'll turn it back to you, but thanks so much for joining us and to our audience for sticking with us through this event. Andrea, thank you. Welcome to Tulane.
Thank you.
Mary,
I'm excited.
And thank to, I actually don't know how to spell it. It's pronounced Joe's last name, but
Joe
to our
Bistro.
orchestra.
Yeah,
Bistro,
thanks,
our
Joe.
orchestrator, Joe, thank you so much for everything.
Well, thank you all. Good evening, and have a wonderful evening and week to come. And thanks again, Mary, for taking the time to be with us. Okay. Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Take care.